It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Patrick Arbore, who will be presenting What is Your Self-Care IQ? Dr. Arbore began his career in the field of aging in 1973. He's the founder and director of the Center for Elderly Suicide Prevention and Grief-Related Services, a program of the Institute on Aging in San Francisco. He conducts workshops and presents lectures locally and nationally on age-related subjects, including elderly suicide prevention, hoarding, substance abuse, passion fatigue, communication, depression, traumatic loss, and many other topics. Patrick is also a senior lecturer in the Human Services Division of Notre Dame de Namur University in Belmont, California, and has been a part-time lecturer in the School of Social Welfare at the University of California at Berkeley. Patrick is the recipient of the 2013 Mental Health and Aging Award presented by the American Society on Aging for outstanding contributions to the field of aging. Dr. Arbore.
And good afternoon, everyone. And I want to thank Shelley and those who were so kind to invite me to participate today. So I'm very glad to be here. And I know some of you I have met over the years, certainly people with senior access, but I also want to say a special hello to Cynthia, who's sitting down there. And I've heard her speak, and she is really a very, very inspiring person too. And also, like you, I was really very struck by Lois and Doris, who are really the kind of epitome, I think, of what it takes to be a healthy caregiver. And a lot of what they were talking about, I'm going to encapsulate in some of my remarks this afternoon, that are really meant to, again, kind of accentuate what Doris and Lois were saying in terms of, what does it mean? What are we up against? What is the experience like? Because everybody in this room who has been a caregiver is a caregiver now, or as we know in some of the statistics you heard earlier today, will be a caregiver in the future. Need to really think about, is that role something that I can take on? Is that something that I could really do? Because my experience over these 40 years working with older adults, adult children, couples that I think Lois or Doris referred to, a couple who are in the dementia experience, and isolation plays such a tremendous role if things are not going to go well. One of the concerns, certainly from my perspective in terms of the Center for Elderly Suicide Prevention, is how just enormously distressing it is to watch your loved one diminish before your eyes over time. That the person who you married, I was struck by one of the ladies when they said, oh, he's thinking about that brunette from years ago, not this gray-haired older woman who's sitting there now. But it's watching our husband or brother, watching our spouse, watching, an adult parent really lose themselves, is just so unbelievably horrendous. And even though one can find a lot of good in caregiving, it's still, we're up against it when we have to deal with this disease. And so I'm just really grateful that so many of you are here today, to just connect around this, because I think that that's the thing that's so important for us to do. One of the things that we do through our 24-hour program, the Friendship Line, is to really offer transfusions of hope, probably like you're your senior care line, that there's just so many just barriers to health when you are in this role of caregiver. Even with those, nuggets of kind of goodwill that we kind of grab onto as I work with my husband, or as you heard these ladies earlier talk about just those day-to-day experiences that can be so challenging, and yet no one really sees that, and yet it's so important that we reveal that and talk about that. And we certainly encourage that with people that call our 24-hour line. It's really about connecting. Connections are what bind us to life. And caregivers especially, my experience has been that they so need that, and they need someone to understand what's going on. And so when we think about the caregiving mission, and you heard again Lois and Doris maybe use other words, but what they're talking about is that, how can we promote independence in our loved one that is suffering with this really insidious disease, this really unbelievable disease for which there still remains no cure. I teach, as you just heard, at Notre Dame Dana Muir, and I teach Intro to Gerontology this term, and I was telling my students with the module was about Alzheimer's disease, and as we were talking, and I showed them this film, The Forgetting. If you haven't seen that film, it's really worthwhile. It's called The Forgetting, and it's a really very marvelous film that looks at 3 different family constellations and how they're dealing with dementia. And my students, and these are adult students and not 18 to 22-year-olds, and afterwards I said, how do you all feel? And they were depressed, And when you heard the list of talks that I give nationwide, well, you get the story on me. I'm not exactly the life of the party when it comes to cheering people up. But the idea is, as some of you were acknowledging, is that one of the many difficulties with dementia is that because it primarily is a disease that affects older adults, we want to distance from it. So my students, I don't think any of them have had a close relationship with anyone that has dementia. And so all they could say is that this is depressing. To get old is depressing enough without having dementia. And we've got to get through to people, not just the people that kind of have the same color hair as I do, but we've got to get to younger people about this as well, so that they can get a grasp on it, and again, work so we can find a way to really find a cure for this really dreadful disease. And part of that, again, caregiving comes out in terms of really trying to foster independence, but also helping somebody function as well as they can, given where they are with that disease, in terms of their spiritual development or their physical or emotional. And as you were hearing, everybody that has dementia is still their own person. It's a unique experience for them. And so we need to also have some kind of a philosophy about caregiving. I have run into, and I know you know people like this, who are very, very reluctant to seek help even though their spouse has dementia, and they don't know what they're doing. One man said to me, he said, well, I have a bedpan and a washcloth. I think I can handle this. Well, no. I think it takes a great deal more. And that's why I think it's important to have some kind of a philosophy about what it means to be in that caregiver role. To have that opportunity to care for somebody in a situation where it's so fundamentally difficult that you watch your spouse or parent or brother or sister lose their sense of self. And so that caregiver decisions must be based upon a reverence for life that this individual has. The thing that really worries me about the future in terms of dementia, and I think it was something you were saying about what if somebody doesn't have the resources? You know, who's going to be there for them? And it's very, very disconcerting to ponder that. Now, what does somebody do when they don't have friends who can help them go here or go there? And that's where we get into this whole other issue, which has to do with premature death. I'm not going to go into that, but I just think it's something we have to really think about and ponder and you know, and really examine as caregivers, am I in this for the long haul? You know, and how much can I tolerate? And as you heard these really exemplary women talking about, which is at some point I have to say, I can't do it anymore. And be able to talk about that in some kind of safety, and certainly support groups and things like that. But there has to be a belief that the human being has these innate rights to function at the highest level they can possibly get to, which may not to the outsider seem very high. And it really just troubles me as we think about people going to the emergency room or seeing their PCP, who may not be too interested in working with this person that has symptoms of a disease. You know, that we would be like, oh, get them out of here. You know, we've got to change that attitude. And we have to make sure that caregivers aren't carrying some of that bias or that ageism. And we just need to be very thoughtful about that. As I was saying, you know, the process of caregiving can be immensely rewarding. And you know, we can feel a lot of, you know, altruism because of that. And I cared for my spouse during this really, really difficult time. But who's caring for you? And so we need to make sure that that caregiver is also reaching out to others and that somebody's there to grab his or her hand as well. Because it can be emotionally exhausting, physically exhausting, and not everyone, you know, has that kind of temperament, you know. And yet we might say to ourselves, I've got to do this. I've got to. I have to take this on. And my family, my adult children, somebody is saying, you've got to do it, Dad. We can't leave Dad, you know, without having, you know, that kind of family support. And I just think we've got to be more realistic about it. And speaking of realism, I always drag Susan Jacoby around with me. I don't know if you've ever heard of this book, Never Say Die. It's on my reference list in my handout there. But she speaks very realistically about what's going on in terms of Alzheimer's, but also in terms of caregivers. And one of the things that she writes, among many, and when I talk about this book, I say that, you know, I think it's a very important book, but it's not for the faint of heart, because she just puts it out there. And those of us who are used to putting our head in the sand when it comes to these kinds of major issues, she really yanks your head out of the sand and says, you've got to face certain things here. And you certainly heard that this morning in terms of the researchers and others. But she writes about the, you know, what it means to deal in the day-to-day arena of caregiving with somebody that has dementia. And she says, moreover, everything one knows about the human capacity for good suggests that the majority of caregivers regard their commitment to care for the person they love as one of the most serious and meaningful endeavors of their lives. It is sad, but all too human, that seriousness and sense of duty, as well as love, do not act as absolute barriers to anger and impatience, and such outbursts wound and shame both the care receiver and the caregiver. And I was so grateful that Lois and Doris acknowledged being impatient, or said things like, oh, it just kind of got on my nerves a little bit, when I think what we sometimes want to say is that I'm really, really pissed off at him. And, but I'm so conditioned not to be able to say that. But what I say to caregivers is I say, let that out. You got to release that energy. That's so tough, you know, because what we don't want to have you do is to be rough with that person. To yank them too hard one day because you're conditioned not to tell the truth about your emotions. And so one of the things that I so recommend with caregivers is the opportunity to be authentic and to be able to say to someone who cares about you too that this is rough, you know, and parts of me that I might not like so much are starting to be revealed. We've got to help people be honest about that. And so I really appreciated them talking about that and acknowledging that. And so we know, as you've heard, I'm sure many times, that so many people care for older people in their own homes, and that is just so challenging. You know, the book that I also recommend is the 36-hour day. You know, I think anybody who's doing this caregiving knows that I try to cram so much into 24 hours, and it's just really tough. And the other thing that we know is that we don't get much support at all from Medicare. And so activities of daily living, you're on your own. And I think that's the message that we really want to shift in terms of caregivers feeling like, I am isolated in this. You know, we often hear, particularly in the beginning when somebody is diagnosed with dementia, so many times caregivers will say to me, oh yeah, and people come, you know, and they want to help, and they want to go to the store for me, or sit with my husband or my wife for a few hours. And we know after several years that help declines or just evaporates, you know, because dementia, you know, is caregiving really for the long haul. We know that people can live between 8 years or 20 years with this disease. And how does a person figure that out, you know? Because there's not necessarily a guidebook, because everybody is different that has symptoms of that disease. You know, certainly there's some overlap, but in terms of how long this individual is going to live, 15 years, 8 years, 12 years, 20 years, you know, that's an amazingly long kind of differences in terms of people with dementia. And so we want to be able to think about the needs of that caregiver. You know, we know that there's a lot of energy around caring for the person with the disease, but also we need to make sure that a spotlight gets put on the caregivers and what that means to be in that position. And so, as you heard the lady say, the need for respite. But many of you know, as much as you know that is so important, don't do it. You know, you don't do it. You might, as some of them said, maybe take a couple hours if you are able to have your person involved in some kind of adult daycare or something like that. But so many people that I can think of right now that I see don't take advantage of that, are reluctant because they don't know how to deal with him or her. And it just aggravates the person. And we've got to think about that caregiver and see how we can help him or her. Think about it differently. It's really very, very tough. And just that constant vigil. You know, it's one thing at my agency, we get to be on call for a week, and it's usually once every 5 weeks. But to be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year, for years. You know, what's going to happen to that caregiver over time? I loved when one of them said, you know, there is life after Alzheimer's. But for some of the caregivers that I see, barely. You know, it's barely a life. And now, with all the little grievings that they have done over the way, now the person isn't here. And what we often see with caregivers is that it's a relief is sometimes what people feel. I feel relieved, you know. But that's just one of many feelings that are going to come. And we have to be very, very sensitive to the grief experience of people who are in that caregiving role. And we want to be able to be familiar with what some of those warning signs are. And again, everyone is different, and everyone expresses their emotions in different ways. But the emotion is there. And what we want to do is make sure that we create a space for that caregiver to be able to say, I am sad. You know, this isn't the way I wanted life to be. I wanted it to be different, and we need to be able to talk about those regrets. We don't have to always have our, sense of, I have to be rather stoic with this. I think there's a time to throw that out the window and just be yourself. Ask yourself, am I feeling sad and depressed? Ask myself, I know this wonderful woman who would be right here, I mean, she would fit right in, and she said, if anybody heard how I scream at my husband, even though I know he can't help it, but when I look at him, I still see my husband. I don't see the disease right off the bat. And then I feel so guilty. And I think we have to be alert to that. Am I losing weight? Do I feel isolated? What's happening to my life? Caregivers must realize that they also have a right to their own life. I'm just not taking care of this individual that I love. I've got to make sure that I have other aspects of my life going on. So we want to pay attention to things like drinking alcohol particularly. And I've seen this with people, particularly when we get into the 10th year. And now keep in mind that the caregiver is now 10 years older. 10 years, again, as this one woman said, I've got this husband, he looks like my husband, but he's not really a husband. What happened? And I said, how do you deal with that? And she said, I drink a lot. And then I forget. And then she said, I'm kind of like him. We need to be able to kind of like, whoa, let's chat. Are you relying on Ativan a bit too much? We need to talk. We need to think about this. But so many times, and I say this later in there, but so many times we, the caregiver, then worry about what you think of us because we want you to think that I'm handling everything. I loved what one of the ladies said, I'm Jill of all trades. It's like, wow, that, our own PR can get us into trouble. Because people are going to say, she can do it. And I've heard this, people said, I said to adult children, why don't you help your mother with your dad? And they say, she can do it all. She says to me, why don't they help me? And I say, speak to your marketing firm. There is a disconnect in terms of the message that's going out there somewhere. We need to pay attention to that. Am I drinking too much? Am I like overstimulated all the time? I'm wired all the time. I'm agitated all the time. That's a fertile field for being too rough with the individual. Because I'm going to be snapping. I'm irritable. Are you screaming or crying? Have you thought of suicide? Are you thinking about his or her death way too often? I'll get my life back when she dies. That's one heck of a way to live your life. That I'll feel better because somebody died. And we know that's not necessarily true. And we've got to give caregivers some avenue for being able, again, to just tell the emotional truth. What is it like to be in this role? And that's not always easy to do. I like this comment by Ogden Nash, who wrote, what is the secret to the trick? How did I get so old so quick? And so, again, what comes into this, if you're caring for somebody for 15 or 18 years, you are 15 or 18 years older. And trying to help somebody get out of bed or into the bathroom. Changing sheets, the linens on a routine basis. Because you don't want to ask for help. And then we've got to think about our society in terms of, and how do we support somebody who may not have the dollars for it? Who's going to pay the bill? Who's going to help? Who's going to support? That's another huge question we have to ask that is often in the back of the mind of that caregiver, which is, how long can I hold out economically? That's tough to have to think about that in addition to everything else. And so we have to be aware of that. And again, we as caregivers also go through changes. In terms of now I was 60 at the time I started this, I'm now 10 years later, I'm 70. And I might be feeling some wear and tear. And am I taking care of myself? And that's a problem as well. And so the caregiver has to watch not only their loved ones decline, but also what's happening to themselves. When they look in the mirror, as this one woman said to me, she said, I look in the mirror and I can't believe that this is the person I have become. Because I can't sleep, I can't eat. I'm always worried that he's going to get lost, as you heard them talk about, that he's going to wander, that I'm not going to, one day I'm just going to go into such a deep sleep, he's going to set the place on fire. Those are severe worries. That's why you'll be so glad I'm looking at Karen, because we'll need a laugh after this. As I said, I'm no picnic. So it's great that Karen is there. So we want to be, aware. We certainly know a lot about Alzheimer's and how that older person who has these symptoms of that disease can become really agitated and can be difficult. One woman said to me about her husband, she said, I thought at the time we got married in our 20s that I married this great big hulking guy and it was really great. But she said, now I look at this great big hulking guy and I'm kind of afraid because he gets so agitated. And I'm afraid that he's going to hit me one day. And I don't want that to happen. And I said, you've got to get help, You've got to reach out and talk to people about this. And so what are some of those signs? And that's part of, the wisdom of being a caregiver. I've got to be able to look at what's going on with me. But when I'm focused 24/7 on the person that has the symptoms of the disease, I'm not noticing myself. I'm not paying attention to what's going on. And over the years, as I said, a lot of people just, disappear. And I was so grateful that Lois and Doris had acknowledged that. People that you think are going to be there for you, with you throughout this disease, just kind of disappear. I don't think they're bad people. I think they just don't know what the heck to do. And if they are in the same cohort group age-wise, they don't want to catch the same disease. And so we back away. Because it is scary, So we need to pay attention to things like fatigue or, increase in the caregiver being sick with colds, flu, that kinds of thing. Thinking that becomes very critical and cynical, There's no more sense of the wonderment of life, We've got to be able to see, particularly as we get older, that life has some meaning, And I love what you said, is it Pauline? No, yes. About, this is my calling, And there's something in this. But it's not external, it's something internal. But I think it takes a great deal of soul searching to find that. But you've got to have time to be able to look internally. But to the, what I call the typical caregiver out there, there's absolutely no time to do that. When I have to think about him or her all the time. And we've got to be aware of that, about decision making. If I'm fatigued, if I'm not taking care of myself, I don't make good decisions. I falter, I might not read what my loved one's agitation is about because I'm just too tired. I can't see it anymore. Emotional distancing, I withdraw. The friends who might still be available want to reach out to me, I say no. And that's a sign, a warning sign that I, the caregiver, am in trouble. And I've got to heed that. I've got to think about that. I've got to call the senior helpline. I've got to call friendship line. I've got to do something. I've got to reach out to somebody to tell the truth to without shame and embarrassment because of that. Overreacting to situations. Again, humor, but it's filled with sarcasm. There's some darkness there. And so we know that the person really wants to say something about what this is like. But but do we give them the opportunity? See, what I think we do, again, I think we project on them this ideal quality that you're going to be this perfect caregiver. And I think we who care for the caregiver need to watch what we project on them and not make them Wonder Women, Superman, that kind of thing. And so we want to be aware of burnout. You know, again, as a, you know, in that caregiving role, we've got to see how much is too much. You know, when does it really come to that I'm just really operating on empty, you know? And what do I do? We need to have a plan. The plans always seem to center around, and I think that's important for the person with the symptoms of the disease, but I've got to have a plan too. What am I going to do? You know? And who do I gather into my inner circle that I can talk about this with? Who I feel won't gossip about me. You know, that's the other thing that I think is so, you know, destructive is, you know, we talk about bullying, how kids bully each other, but I think grown-ups do that too, through gossip. And we need to be very, very thoughtful about that. And how deterioration occurs in relationships outside of the person who has these symptoms. And you know, again, when you hear caregivers say, you know, my best girlfriend of 40 years never calls me anymore. What's up with that? You know? And how do I even process that? Because I'm so busy caring for my husband or my brother or my whoever it is. You know, again, I talk about alcohol self-absorption, you know, which really is a sign perhaps of depression. That I don't know what is out there in the world because I don't participate in a normal way anymore. Not showing up for appointments yourself, or if you do some volunteer work, you just don't go anymore. And you know, we've got to really examine that in terms of what that means. And so we have to look at the high cost of caring. You know, one of the aspects of burnout has to do with compassion fatigue. You know, we've run into overtime in terms of compassion because I'm not getting filled anywhere else. You know, I'm just constantly giving. And so compassion fatigue is the high cost of caring. You know, I'm giving too much and getting too little back. And so that's the physical and emotional and spiritual fatigue that takes over a person and causes a decline in the ability to express joy. The ability to express, again, a wonderment for life. You know, what this all means. Thank you. And so we need to be aware of that. But to be aware means I've got to have some opening into my own psyche. You know, I've got to have some space. I need to be able to, you know, sit in this beautiful county, you know, under a tree and just kind of reflect on what's happening to me. But I have no time. You know, one man said to me, I don't think anymore. There's no time. It's tasks all the time. I'm constantly running the dishwasher. I'm constantly running the washing machine. You know, I'm constantly moving. We've got to slow down. You know, and that's what I love about opportunities to come to conferences or workshops, is that for some period of time, maybe between 10 and 5 or whatever it is, that there's an opportunity to sit and wonder. You know, if you're not in the caregiving role, to wonder what it might be like to do so. You know, what would it be like to be in these ladies' shoes? So we want to be aware of that. And so some of the tips that I think are useful to have in your caregiver toolkit when you are working with someone with symptoms of this disease is that, you know, we want to create, as Lois or Dara said, a positive mood for interaction. Somehow or other, I've got to figure this out, and that's what I mean, that if I'm pretending to create something positive, it's an illusion. It's like being at Caesar's palace. This is not in Rome, it's in a desert in Las Vegas. It's like, wow, you know, the Paris Hotel, please. It's not real, you know, you're not really in France. and we want to be aware of our body language, our attitude, because one of the things that we see all the time at Institute on Aging in terms of our Lifeways program with people that have various degrees in terms of stages of dementia is that, oh my gosh, somebody might not have that cognitive ability, but their emotions are on overdrive. They can sense, when a caregiver is not present. And it's so uncanny and so interesting. And so we want to be aware of the message that we convey. How do we convey affection? One of the other issues that we know happens, which is, that I'm in this relationship with my partner, my spouse, and my spouse, my husband, now sees me as his mother. And so how does affection get conveyed anymore? Because he really sees me as his mother. I'm his wife of 50 years, but what he sees is his mother. How do we handle that? Who do we talk to about that? Not only am I losing my husband, but I'm losing this whole huge part of my marriage. And it's just gone. And what do I do with it? How do I grieve that? How do I kind of reconnect with my husband who sees me as his son? Not easy. We've got to figure that out. And we want to be able to get that person's attention. Limit distractions and noise. I love the concept of that fibbing burger. Oh, that was so great. In my business we call it therapeutic lying. But I like your term for it much better. Those fiblets, right? Because when we tell the truth to someone who can't have that cognitive ability to really dissect that sentence or that paragraph, and they just wind up getting upset, as you wisely said, mom's in bed sleeping. We'll talk to her in the morning. Redirect. There are other ways that we can do that. And keep your messages, very short. But the problem with that is that's not how you used to interact. This is all happening without, again, a guidebook. You're just kind of trying to figure it out. And that's why groups, as you both were talking about, are so powerful and so helpful, because we want to hear, how do you manage this? Might be a little different because, as you both were saying, your husbands were different people. But there are things we can do, tips that can be helpful. Refrain from asking open-ended questions because the person's just going to probably get upset. And so you don't need to do that. Ask one question at a time, use simple words. These are all tips that can be very useful down the road. I love this though. Listen with your ears, your eyes, but most importantly with your heart. Yes, the person may be asking you the same question they asked you 2 minutes ago, and they're going to ask it again, and on and on. But there's something else. And I know those of you who care for somebody with dementia, whether it's in a family situation, family caregiver, or in a more formal setting, professional caregiver, is that you know that in there is that person. We can't ever lose sight of that. And it always worries me when somebody says, oh, well, she's demented. It's like, no, she's not demented. She's a person who has a disease, And we've got to educate people about that. Because any one of us could have this disease. And we know in terms of the statistics you were hearing earlier today, that many of us, when we turn 80, 85, are either going to be caring for somebody with this disease, or we'll have those symptoms ourselves. And so anything we can do that helps open this up in a wider way, that helps gives relief or educates people, is an investment in our own aging, and we need to be able to pay attention to that. And so there's a lot of ways that we can do. As I said, redirect. Let's go for a walk. Let's have a glass of tea. Let's do something. Because you don't have to answer every question that somebody with symptoms of this disease asks you. You can say, let's go for a walk. Let's look at this plant. Oh, those colors are really something. there are ways that we can redirect, and that's important as well. And I love this too. It's okay to remember the good old days. When I was working with this couple, and he had early onset, and she said what he really loves is Leonard Skinner. And so that's kind of blasting out, and you can see he was really calm with that. He really liked that. And so we want to kind of be where they are in terms of what soothes that individual, what brings some sense of calmness, some comfort to them. And maintain your sense of humor is something that, again, I think is very crucial in terms of having in your toolkit in terms of a caregiver, is that sometimes I have to laugh. And that's, so important. And we want to be aware of how we manage our emotion, emotional responsibility. How do I do that? And I've got to think about that, because I'm going to be under stress no matter how much we try to support a caregiver. There's still a lot of stress there, and that stress comes with a lot of emotion. And how do I regulate my own emotion? How do I manage my own emotion? And we've got to think about that. We've got to, deal with that, and we manage it differently. But anger is the one that I see the most often, and I talked about this earlier. But it's something that we've got to pay attention to. I'm thinking about a woman who was driving her husband to his appointments, and he had really a moderate dementia, maybe a little bit worse. And he would tell her always how to drive, because traditionally he drove all the time, and she was the passenger. But now she's the driver. And she said even when he could no longer speak, he would go, and get all rattled. And she said one day, she said, I pulled off to the side of the road, and I reached over and I smacked him as hard as I could. And then I started sobbing. And she said, I knew I was in trouble. I needed to talk to somebody, And I'm trying to say, don't wait till then. Don't wait till an emotional crisis. You want to act on it sooner. Not to wait then. And be aware, I just sent a voice message to a caregiver this morning who was very upset and, screaming at her husband because she didn't answer the phone when I called. So I left a message and I said, anger's okay. It's a basic human emotion. Nobody has to be harmed because you're feeling angry, But I said, I implore you to ask yourself, how did you learn about anger as a child, as a kid in your family of origin? What was the family dynamic like? If somebody was angry, did life as we know it come to an end? That's rage. That's not anger. That's hostility. That's not anger. And you can say, I'm angry. It doesn't have to harm or hurt or shame or undermine someone. But we get really confused when stress gets in the way. So we've got to pay attention to that. And we want to just be aware of shame, again, embarrassment. I'm afraid to ask for help because people will think I'm weak. And I said to this one woman, I said, well, so what? Who is judging you anyway? They're not there in your situation, dealing with all the things you're dealing with. In this case, she was dealing with her husband, but also with her sister, who was her best friend, who also had been diagnosed with dementia. And her whole support system was torn out from under her. And she said that she had asked a girlfriend to help with taking, I think it was the sister, to adult day health. And the friend said, no. And I get boundaries, I understand that. And I said to her, I said, well, then ask somebody else. And she said, I just can't do it. It took everything I had to ask her. And I said, what is it that bothers you? And she said, I'll be perceived as weak. Weak, And I said, I don't perceive you that way. But I perceive you as stuck. And I perceive you as not knowing how to work with your support network. And maybe you need to rethink that. And that's tough. So we need to be aware of some of these really difficult things, and also how a caregiver responds to people's conversation. We can get very defensive, that sort of thing. and we can be passive aggressive, that sort of thing, and that's where cynicism comes into it, sarcasm. And what the caregiver is often trying to say is that I'm angry. I'm just angry. I don't know how to express it very well. I'm just angry. And we need to think about this. I worry that people are judging me, as I said. I'm worried that people don't think I'm up to it. I'm inadequate. And what that does is that it silences caregivers. And so those of us who care for the caregiver need to be very aware of how we communicate. And that we, again, didn't project some kind of idyllic experience of perfection on this individual. Even though Lois and Doris are pretty perfect, I mean, look at you two. I was like, whoa, I'm impressed here. But I know that's not how you always look in the day-to-day, right? But I just think it's so important to see that I don't have to be perfect. But we who care for the caregiver need to make sure that message comes across. And that's not always on the tip of our tongue. And we need to think about that because we don't want the caregiver to be walking around with these kinds of internal feelings of hopelessness, of inadequacy, because they may not be comfortable asking for help, for talking about this kind of thing. And we don't want to really somehow exacerbate feelings of helplessness, so that the person feels there's no way out, and we've got to really watch that. One of the things that Donna Cohen has been looking at from the University of South Florida is that when caregivers reach a limit and they just feel like, I can't do it anymore, but they have made a promise to their spouse that I would never let anybody care for you. And somewhere along the line, they might have had this agreement, which is, if it gets too bad, I will kill you, and then I'll kill myself. And that is something that we want to be very, very, very careful about in our communities. Is that when caregivers, slip out of sight, they no longer go to Senior Access or some other Dante program where the person who is in the caregiving role is really, really frightened about what's happening to their partner, their spouse, and they're thinking very dangerous thoughts. That happens, and we've got to be aware of it. We've got to be alert, and that's why we don't want people to escape, into this isolated place where it's just me, the caregiver, and the person I care for, and there's nobody else. We've got to watch that because that can contribute to an enormous sense of helplessness, which isn't very good, and then of course that helplessness can just flow right into guilt. And we've got to be aware that the caregiver is going to be carrying not only this mountain of tasks that they feel they are responsible for, but also this mountain of emotion that is experienced as too much. I don't know how to deal with my guilt. The lady who slapped her husband in the car, she said, I can't tell you how long I wanted to do that. And she said, this is when he was well, I wanted to do that. And she said, I think I need to talk about my anger. And I said, absolutely, it's okay to talk about it. It's okay to talk about the guilt, that I was so rough or harsh when he was trying to get dressed, that I pushed him too hard, or, he pushed his wife that has symptoms of dementia too hard. Somebody's got to be there, to be able to help, help somebody work through those difficult emotions that are so painful, and the grief associated with this. As I said earlier, we go from, sometimes what people think, particularly in the early stages of dementia, is that it's so often, well, maybe they don't have Alzheimer's disease. Maybe it isn't dementia. Because look, they've been doing so well for so long. And I know that you know that. It's such a trap. I love when you both said, get tested. That's so important. And then to be able to trust the person that you have performed that neurological test. Talk about what it looks like, what this disease does. because people do. They might stay kind of stable for a while. But then it's going to go from that down, to a lower level of functioning, and then down again, and down again. And I know just because of the brief time limit you had when you went to the I can't swallow anymore stage. There are lots of stages in between, and I think you were kind of alluding to some of that, that is filled with grief. This is really happening. This is really happening. And we need to make sure that we're providing support for that person so that they can grieve those stages along the line. We know in terms of programs that care for older people with dementia and support groups, I've spoken in many support groups over the years, and I say to them, let us grieve together, and let us not forget the individual where the spouse does die, the brother, sister does die. One woman said, I still belong in this support group. And I said, I absolutely believe it. And she said, even though my husband died, I still feel like a caregiver. And I said, yeah, because you have to grieve that too. That's changing. And we've got to be able to find a place, and oftentimes that place of safety is there. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And so anyway, you can look at this handout at your convenience, but be aware of depression, be aware of isolation and loneliness, and how loneliness can evolve into depression. And we're not good at recognizing depression. We're not good at treating something that we don't know is even happening to ourselves. And so we need to be able to get over whatever shame and embarrassment that might come with a mental health issue, because we shouldn't be depressed over this situation. But depression is highly remediated. There are ways that the caregiver doesn't have to go into such a decline. We can help that person and be aware of that. And just again, the physical reactions associated. I talked about the loss of intimacy and just those changes, and just to be able to take care of yourself. The final thing that I want to say, and then if you have a question or two, I'd be happy to attempt to respond. But it comes down to about 10 primary things that caregivers need. And we who care for a caregiver want to be able to support, which is to give the caregiver attention, do not run away. And I imagine here, it's like preaching to the choir, but for everybody here to be able to tell your friends that, hey, when your friend, when your family member, whoever is in a caregiving role, don't ignore them, stay with them, give them attention, compassion, give them time for respite, time, as you said, to just go out and get your nails done or whatever it might be. Respect for the caregiver role, to be able to show that. Dedication. Acknowledge that ability. As Pauline was saying, this is a calling. This is what I'm meant to do. I might as well get into it. But to have somebody else acknowledge that. As I said, be emotionally honest. We as caregivers, or we who care for the caregiver, want to make sure we're modeling that as well, which is if I feel afraid because of this illness that you, my good friend, or my family member is dealing with, I need to tell you that. It's only fear. It's only an emotion. And I need to be emotionally honest with that. To be in a position of advocacy with the Alzheimer's Association, with other vendors that you see here who are willing to say to the community, this disease is affecting, so many thousands of our community members. We need to be present. We need to be able to take a stand, to be understanding. But above all, what we want to do as people who care for a caregiver is to be able to try to provide a sense of well-being. I'm here with you. I support you. Let me know what I can do. I'll go to the store. I'll be here with your husband or spouse or son or daughter, whoever that is with the disease. I can do this. But then the care person for the caregiver also needs to have support as well, because this disease is scary. particularly in the latter part of this disease. So I want to end my comments with that. I have a list of references that may be helpful to you or to add to the ones that you were talking about earlier. And I just want to say to all of you, I think it takes a great deal of courage to be a caregiver. I think it takes a great deal of courage to be someone that is dealing personally with that disease of dementia. And I think it also takes a great deal of courage to know when to say, I need some help. And I hope you can help me. Thank you very much.
We have probably time for one question, but I know Dr. Arbore, you'll be here for a little bit. We're going into a 15-minute break. Anybody have one question? Who's the closest to the mic?
Question? Comment?
Comment.
Hey, don't leave me hanging here. I'm asking for help.
Okay.
Wait, there's one.
Oh, too late. I need my exercise today.
Thanks so much for your information. Recovery, so you talked a lot about the symptoms. What would you say is the number one thing to do to get help? What is it that helps? Is it talking to other people? That's what I wanted to hear.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good question. It starts now. You know, we have to look at our lives and be able to say, how easy is it for me now to ask for help? You know, and can I practice that? Can I talk to my adult children? Can I talk to my neighbors? Can I talk to, you know, my long-term friends and just see, like a litmus test? If I ask you for help, and I know some of you are already like, no, I don't like to do that. And that might be fine if we're never in a caregiving role. But we know, and you've heard the speakers this morning, and both of you, you can't really do this alone. But I would say, start now and ask yourself, how easy is it for me to ask for help? And even just the thought of it, do I start to feel something internally that feels like embarrassment? You know? So I think that being able to ask for help really requires practice, but not waiting to the 11th hour, because then we might not do it. So I think we have to practice that now, you know, before we go into that crisis. And then we get familiar with asking for help, because we know some people are going to say no. But some people are going to say yes. We just have to ask them. So practice. Thank you.
Thank you so much.